and in specifics, what we do in the sort of space of food systems and health. Before I start, I just want to recognise the enormous contributions that my colleague Martin Mortimer made before he died, sadly, at the end of 2019. Martin was an inspirational figure in terms of thinking about food systems, and he laid the foundations for the creation of a centre on sustainable food systems at the University of Liverpool. I also want to reflect a little bit about when we start thinking about food and food security issues, the kinds of things that we faced in the past. This is a picture painted by Francois Millet, and he drew this picture back in the 1850s in rural France. When this was displayed in Paris, it created a real stir because people got very worried there was going to be another French Revolution. You can see these women here are actually picking grain off the soil after the harvest. They were that poor that they had to actually do this to sort of make enough to eat. Now, obviously, as we move forward, we've ended up in a situation where we have plenty of food, or we appear to have plenty of food in many different spaces, but we're still living in an area of very rapid change. And if you look at human population growth, that's been incredibly fast. There's been lots of problems with regards how we manage that process, and quite often we talk about kind of Malthusian ideas that we're going to run out of food. Now, in that kind of context, the University of Liverpool has kind of recognised the importance of food systems, and we actually established a food systems centre in two years ago. And with regards to that context, where do we actually sort of sit? Well, if we look at population growth, as I said before, it's been very, very rapid. So when I was born back in 1965, there was about 3 billion people. We're quickly moving towards a situation where we've got 8 billion people on the planet. And much of the recent population increase and the continuing population increase will actually take place in urban areas, mainly in Asia and Africa. So what does that really look like? Well, sorry, before I pass on to the next bit, just remembering as well that every time we increase the numbers of humans, we also increase the numbers of animals we keep in livestock systems. And we've currently got, I reckon, between 190 to 200 kilos of domesticated animals per person across the globe, which is actually pretty large number. So with regards to urban growth, where is that taking place? Well, there's obviously growth in the big cities in Asia. There's increasing pace of growth in the urban centres of Africa, and there's less growth in Europe, and in some places there's actually places that are actually starting to shrink rather than grow. So we've got quite a lot of challenges in terms of how we start to think about feeding people in this particular space. And one of the challenges that we face is this movement of people from the rural to the urban space. Now, as people do that, their food systems stop being local and start being national. Once the urban population start to settle, they will have children, and their children will become urbanized. And again, there will be a shift in terms of how that food system operates. So what we're seeing quite often now is that the food system stops being national, it starts being international. So the sort of distance between where our food is actually produced and where our food is actually consumed is growing. And the disconnect between the agricultural and land use part of the food system is also being divorced from the urbanized populations that we have. Now, in the context of this, we're moving from a food system where much of our production, processing and consumption would have been more or less in the family and households, where we've got purchased inputs to some extent and largely production for locally based communities, to a much more complex type of production system where there's movements of product across that particular chain to consumers that will be very distant from it, movement of money, and also a lot of people actually involved in that process. Now, the RUC APS project obviously is very much associated with this middle part, understanding how we move things from the input side all the way through to consumers, and how do we manage risk across that. So we've gone from a situation where things were quite simple in terms of how we think about food systems and how we manage them, to something that's quite complex, both in terms of its length, in terms of its economic activity, in terms of the jobs, but also the geographical dispersion of that particular food system. What does that look like in terms of production overall? Well, These are data pulled together from FAO. You can see that we've managed to steadily increase the amount of grains and important carbohydrate crops that we grow. And we've done that largely through increases in crop yield. So we've been very successful in terms of improving the output from crops overall. One of the new additions to our food systems in the last 20 or 30 years has been vegetable oils. And the increase in this particular area has been absolutely enormous. And that's been partly through an expansion of the crop area, things like palm oil and soybeans, but it's also been about increasing crop yields. Now, that particular increase probably will continue, and I think is influencing quite strongly both what we eat and how we eat things overall. If you look at the area that I tend to spend most of my time thinking about, there's also been a huge increase in terms of meat and fish availability. So in the 1950s, we probably had about 25 kilos of meat and fish available per person per year. By 2011, that had actually more than doubled to just over 60 kilos. How has that been achieved? Well, we've actually changed the way we keep animals. We've changed the types of animals we have. We've improved the health of the animals and the nutrition in which they're being fed. Now, overall in that particular system, we've gone from a structure where we've got food grains passing into humans and animals being tightly incorporated into the production systems at farm level, with crop residues being fed back, and some influence in the wider environment with regards grazing and foraging, with some oil crop use. Meat, eggs, fat coming off these systems actually not being a hugely important part of our diets. What have we done in the last 50 years? Well, we've had two major crop revolutions. So we've increased the amount of grain available, but we've also increased the oil crop production. We've removed quite a lot of animals out of the system. We've relied more and more on combustion engines, which means that we can actually cultivate more land, we can use more soil types, and there's much less dependency on animal manure as a fertilizer. It's been replaced by chemical fertilizers out of the oil industry. And that's generated a lot of cheap food and cheap feed grains. And that system has now changed to a large extent across the world. Animals are no longer really strongly incorporated into our food grain production. There's been a lot more oil crops grown, and there's been so much growth in the crop side that actually there's surplus grains and surplus oilseed cakes that can be fed to animals, generating a lot more meat, eggs and meat from those particular systems. And this wild environment that we have has become less important as a source of food, probably more important from a source of tourism. The other element moving away from the farm system is that we actually have changed totally our kind of food processing and distribution process. So we encounter quite a lot in many different spaces the use of large transport, big processing systems, to actually have quite mechanized, quite industrialized systems of processing. And we're transporting crops and livestock products across long distances from cities and towns to actually then process them. And the processing that we've done is also changing. So we've gone from actually buying mainly live animals to perhaps buying a dressed bird, to then actually splitting out the meat from that bird and on into a situation where we have the chicken nugget. So the impact of that process is kind of interesting. It's provided food that's cheaper, potentially reducing waste, maybe making the system more resilient. But what about the impacts on human health and the health system in general? Well, overall, if we look at the health changes in terms of disability adjusted life years between 1990 and 2017, you'd see two things: less health loss over time and a changing pattern of the types of health problems. So this blue part in these diagrams here represents non-communicable diseases, including food-related non-communicable diseases, NCDs. And you can see between 2017 and 1990, there has been an increasing proportion of health loss across the globe, which is related to non-communicable diseases, of which food-related diseases are actually a large part. We've achieved that to some extent by improving our health systems, by spending more money, but we've also done that change in the health overall by improving our nutrition, and to some extent actually going over that particular limit. So if you take what I've said, then you would assume that the food system is in a success story situation. And even if you think about the fact that more recently we've had these challenges with COVID-19 in terms of our food system. Last week, The Economist has published an article in its leader column saying that the food system is a miracle. We've actually managed to create a situation where, even with COVID-19, we've managed to manage very well the kind of food security angles. But is that the entire story? I'd kind of say no. The Economist makes some reference to this. So this is a UK food system back in 2016. A large part of the system that we've closed down is actually in the retailing, is in the catering and restaurant business. And that particular part of the food system in the UK back in 2016 was actually 43% of expenditure. And it was also nearly half of the employment in the food system. And what we did with the COVID reaction was actually close all that down. And that's created many problems with regards to food waste and food management across the piece. We've also got situations in developing countries. This is a map of the beef and small ruminant meat food system in Nairobi, what we did about 5 years ago. This system is very complex, and what they've done in their particular system is actually close down their trading aspects here. So we end up with a situation where people lose their jobs, people are denied access to certain types of products, and we create chaos. And the consequences of those types of things have been seen in different spaces. This is a picture taken in Napoli, in Italy, where there was apparently situations where people were literally starving because they couldn't get hold of food because of the reaction to COVID-19. So on top of the disease itself, COVID-19 disease itself, our reactions to the presence of this disease have created quite a lot of hardship across the world. Now, I raise these issues because for me, food security is not just about quantity. It's not just about having enough to eat. It's also about having food systems that are actually free of biological and chemical hazards. So it's about improving safety. And it's also about trying to satisfy our nutritional needs in terms of quality. So there are 3 dimensions to food security that we're interested in Liverpool. It's about having enough to eat. It's about having safe food. It's about having food that's actually of sufficient quality to meet our nutritional needs. And we need to recognize that in our new food systems, these food systems that have emerged as people have become richer and been more urbanized, we actually do have problems. So we've had the emergence of a new pathogen, mad cow disease. We have changing patterns of foodborne disease issues, things like Salmonella and Campylobacter. We've had the emergence of very new pathogens in different spaces. Avian influenza would be one of them, African swine fever another, and the re-emergence of things like foot and mouth disease in ruminants and cattle and sheep and goats. More recently, if you've been following the press, there's been lots and lots of anxiousness about the antimicrobial resistance changes that could be related to the antimicrobial use in livestock. And finally, we need to recognize that the food system is probably associated with the release of coronaviruses, not just COVID-19, but also the earlier outbreak of SARS. And these are about having food systems that interact with exotic.
Hello, Jonathan. We lost your connection, I think. Hello?
Okay.
Yes, for some reason we lost your audio.
Okay. Are you still with me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Can you still see the screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Um, so, yeah. So to emphasize this point, we're looking at a situation where we've got some major issues in terms of the emergence and re-emergence of diseases that appear to have increased in their frequency. So across the last 30 years, we've had some really major events. In the last 2 years, we've had two of the biggest events ever. So African swine fever has emerged into China, the biggest producer of pork in the world, and has decimated the pork industry. And of course, in the last 3 months, we've had the emergence of COVID-19, which has obviously disrupted our health systems, but it's also disrupted our economies in terms of how we've responded to that disease. These are things that have emerged from our food systems. Now, in addition to that kind of public health dimension of emergence of diseases, we also know our food systems are affected by climate change in terms of long-term trends of temperature and rainfall and the frequency of major weather events. But food systems also impact on the climate itself. They lead to shifts in land use and deforestation, which can affect micro and local climates. And of course, the greater numbers of domesticated animals that we keep can actually change the sort of gas emissions from the particular animals that we have on the planet. And these kind of combined actions of people may set in motion a real vicious cycle from our food systems with regards to the environment. So there's an area of that which is actually really important in terms of thinking about the externalities from the food system. And then the final piece that I think tends to be ignored, we have a pandemic at the moment which is about an infectious disease, COVID-19, but the biggest pandemic we're actually facing at the moment is actually about nutrition. And we have two different elements to this. We have a situation where literally millions of people are still not getting enough to eat. We have children who are still starving and actually are not getting their proper development. And then on top of it, we have an overweight and obesity rate, which is partly related to how the food system operates. In the UK sense, this is actually having a really bad impact in terms of the longevity of lives, in terms of NHS costs, National Health Service costs, probably about 6 or 7% of our national health costs is actually related to managing food-related non-communicable diseases with an economic loss of an annual scale of about £27 billion. And in terms of sort of very personal issues, 140 amputations are taking place every week in the UK, just simply down to food-related diabetes. And if you want to put that into context with COVID-19, many of the people that are suffering from disease in a very serious way, possibly leading to death, tend to be overweight and obese. So this is actually kind of a double issue across the piece. So when we're thinking about resilience, food security issues in the food system, we need to think about doing a few things. So one is creating a stable system, creating a system that generates both safe food and also a food system that doesn't generate dangerous pathogens. And we need to have quality food that actually doesn't create nutritional problems. And this requires an interdisciplinary, intersectorial approach. So we need to understand the very work that you've been doing with the RUC APS. We need to understand the value chains that make up the food systems, the institutional environment in which they operate, and also how people behave within those systems. So our understanding of food systems really needs to think about minimizing risks and consequences to public health. It needs to think about the impacts on the environment, and it also needs to think about optimizing use of resources. And with regards to sort of challenges and future prospects, I think we need to recognize that as we move forward, our food systems are going to increasingly take this kind of shape, where there aren't very many people involved in this kind of agricultural production, but we have a huge number of people actually being fed on a day-to-day basis. So in the UK, again, about 340,000 people work in this national production space, and yet they're feeding on a day-to-day basis 65 million people. If we get something wrong in this space, then we obviously have a huge impact on the health of those people. In addition, the space that Jorge and his team spend a lot of time working on here is where we've got the major manufacturing capacity within the UK. Also, it's a major employer, and it's a major part of the economy. Then on the health side, which is obviously very, very important, we need to recognise that we've got probably around 4 billion people in the healthy middle. We've still got nearly 1 billion people who are undernourished, and we've got an increasing number of people who are overweight. Now, in those two particular sides, there are really serious health impacts. So the stunting and wasting we're seeing can lead to poor cognitive development, and therefore the children in that space have no chance of having proper development and income earning issues. And on the overweight space, we're actually creating problems that have long-term issues in terms of health. It creates human disease, it creates healthcare costs, and it generates poor economic development. Underpinning all this health issue with regards to nutrition, of course, is the food system itself. And we need to make sure that food system operates in the best way possible to make sure that we actually push people out of this undernourished space. And we also make sure that we don't have as many people in this overweight space. So what are we doing in Liverpool to do this? Well, we're taking the food system in its entirety. We're thinking very carefully about the decision-making environment in which things take place. And we're also investigating what I would describe at the moment as being the obesogenic environment in which consumers shop and operate on a regular basis. And our three priorities in this space are to optimize the efficiencies to deliver the right food in the right places at the right time, minimize the public health problems caused by the food system, and minimize the environmental damage caused by that food system. There are a few things here that I'd like you to perhaps have a look at. Don't get worried about the references I put here, but I particularly like you to have a look at the CESFS video that we've put together. And there's a whole range of things around the work we've done on the Nairobi food systems. And one or two references there. Jorge, that's it from me. I'm going to hand you back.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much for your presentation. Many thanks. Not sure if there is any question from the audience. Not sure if Horacio or Rina, do you have any question for Jonathan?
Congratulations for the presentation. I liked it very much. And I have just one question. You didn't mention in your presentation the role that education can have. I mean, school. I think that children should be used since they are very young to have the right food, or to feed them in a proper way. So do you think that programs that can be you can taught at school can improve the level of health or the level of good good use of food?
Thanks for the question. I think it's definitely an important component, and I think ignorance around food is actually something that is different across many different societies. One of my concerns is that then reduces it back down to individual behavior, and we assume that most of the things we do are led by our own choices. I think the food systems we've created actually mean that a lot of the decisions that take place are not actually at the individual level. They're at a corporate level. So things about how foods are selected for growth, how animals are selected, and how foods are mixed is done in the food processing side. So there needs to be a combination of that kind of educating the consumer.
Yeah.
And I agree through early stages. I think it's too late if we just rely on the sort of adult point.
Yeah.
But in combination, a much better understanding about the impact of poor goal setting across the food system to generate the right types of food for the people actually doing the shopping. So one of the areas that we're particularly interested in, and it's one of the areas that I've talked to Jorge a lot about, is actually understanding a little bit about the kind of objective functions across the food system. Is that contributing overall to better health, or is it just simply about generating cheap food? And the two things don't necessarily go hand in hand.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But thanks
Thank
for your
you.
question. That's a really nice point.
Thank you.
Well, I have a few questions also for Jonathan, but maybe we can cover all together. I mean, of course, the way how we understand food systems is changing a little bit. I mean, as Jonathan said before, there has been many outbreaks or shocks in history that make us think on how food system really should be dealt with. But this is a question for Jonathan first. So how do you see that the current food systems can be maintained considering all these new uncertainties that are happening and seems that they are not going to stop? So shall we be global? Shall we be local? Is still this global collaboration still is possible, or shall we just create like a borders again, or can we be that global as we expected to be in the past? Because I remember that just a few months ago, global supply chains, global connection, a globalized world, but now it's like please don't meet each other, So how do you see from the food system point of view that this will be dealt in the future?
I can say from my own personal perspective that I can't see, after nearly 2 months of the lockdown here, and probably 3 months in spaces like Spain and Italy,
Yeah.
I can't see any change in the supply of foods coming in from Spain and Italy. Maybe that's quite resilient. So the transport systems seem to continue, even down to getting products from places like North Africa appears to continue. So, but they're quite specific products. I'm not sure whether we've seen all the ramifications of the changes, because some of the products may be coming by boat, and maybe there's been interruptions in terms of loading boats that will probably take 6 weeks maybe to start to kick in. But there are two questions, Jorge, I think, in response, because it's quite complex. One is, I think there is an increasing tendency for big outbreaks of disease, and I'm not sure it's not just about human disease, it's also about animal disease. So how do we manage that? Well, if you go back to the past of the 1800s of Europe, when we had similar types of big change in food systems, one of our reactions was to actually put more money into the veterinary system and into the animal health system. And I think parts of the world do not have sufficient investment in that space at the moment to actually manage the numbers of animals and the complexity of the health of those animals. So we have to have a response if we want to manage these things more carefully. So I think that's kind of ongoing. It just we need to sort of direct that a little bit more carefully. With regards to maintaining trade across the world, if we don't keep doing trade, then I think we'll have pockets of people starving. And I'm not just talking about Africa here. I mean, the UK depends on trade for 50% of its food. So what would happen if we couldn't get rice out of Asia into the UK? There'd be panic, or pasta from Italy. We are very, very dependent on trade. Many places are. So anybody who thinks they can sort of change that and try and replace it with something with local food supply, I think is actually not looking at the real data underpinning our food quantity issues, at least. So, I mean, reading The Economist this week, I think it's a reasonable summary that actually the food system seems to have responded pretty well. There's been bits and pieces of wastage. And it ends with a note that let's hope it keeps functioning in that way, because if it doesn't, there'll be chaos in societies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I don't know. I mean, for my impression, in my impression, one of the things that I expect with all this COVID-19 is, normally I was expecting like not being able to get all the type of food that we want to, but apart of, for instance, having some issues with the online orders and so on, but I don't have the feeling that there is a lot of shortage in food.
No.
Which is very interesting. Of course, we don't have the same quality, all the high variety of products, but I have the feeling that there is no such a thing. I mean, the issue really, I noticed that is because with all this lockdown and quarantine, people that can work and then eventually they cannot afford, let's say, food, or they cannot access food. But it's not that the food is not there, which is very interesting, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, I think that this also presents a new opportunity for farmers, for instance, to sell their product directly, try to shorten the supply chain in some ways. It's super interesting, the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it goes back to Amartya Sen's work back in the 1970s when he was looking at the famines in India, and his conclusion was there wasn't a shortage of food, there was a shortage of money for the people who needed it. And I think potentially that's the same situation we've got in many different spaces. But I do think I do think there is a fragility to some of our spaces of food systems that we haven't yet sort of cottoned on to. So, I'm surprised, for example, that we've managed to keep the flow of fresh fruit and vegetables into the UK. Given that I'm assuming that a lot of the transport is based on passenger planes, and that seems to have continued. So partly the variety change, it might be related to that particular aspect. But I agree with you. I think one of the things is if you stop people from working, then they can't afford to buy food. That's really worrying. And I think that's been the case in the developing countries. I think we've seen a lot of hardship, not due to COVID-19 disease, but due to the way we've responded to COVID-19 disease risks.
Correct.
And that is disturbing in that we haven't had very good decision making taking place.
Yeah.
With that situation.
Yeah. Correct. Exactly. Well, I mean, this is all my questions. So, Irina, do you have any comment about that? How is the situation in Italy?
I want just to say that in Italy, what happened is that the prices of vegetables and fruits increased a lot. Okay. But this is done mainly because there is no people that can work in the fields for harvesting so fruits and vegetables. And this is connected to because there are a lot of immigrants that usually are in the fields. And usually these immigrants are not regular immigrants, and they are not well paid. And they are, we say, it's a black work. It's not an official one. So the problem is that also farmers, they prefer to have this kind of workers because they pay less. But it is also because the money that is in the food chain is for farmers is very low. And so this is a very big problem, because if a farmer cannot afford to pay a regular salary for people because there is no enough money that the big distributors or the big companies that buy food, they don't pay enough the farmers for producing food. So I think that we should, politicians should reconsider the benefits of all the chain and to pay much more the first part of the chain, so the farmers, the producers, in order also to have all the people involved in this part of the chain that can be well paid, and so they can work in a regular way.
Yeah, I agree. Your description in Italy mirrors, I think, what's happened in the UK, where there was much talk about British people doing the picking and collecting of food, but the pay and the conditions that they were being asked to work in were not acceptable. So they ended up bringing people in from outside to do those jobs. So it is a real challenge. Yeah, and I think governments will be very reluctant to try and tinker with the system because, yeah, they've had their fingers burnt in the past on this. But I think it is important we look at that rebalance and understand how badly people are treated in these systems. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Okay.
Well, this was really good. Thank you
Yes.
for your
Thank
time. This session has been recorded. It's going to be uploaded into the website for the audience that would like to have a look later.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, and Jonathan, by the way, because your participation in this presentation, we're going to send you an online or an electronic certificate of presentation later on.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jorge.
Oh, just you know. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. Let's keep in touch. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.